This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ted DeLorme in Fort Mill, South Carolina, during July and August 2006. Love Conquers All by Robert C. Benchley. Chapter 46, On Bricklaying. After a series of introspective accounts of the babyhood, childhood, adolescence, and inevitably gloomy maturity of countless men and women, it is refreshing to turn to Bricklaying in Modern Practice by Stuart Scrimshaw. Hey-ho, one says, back to normal again. For bricklaying is nothing if not normal, and Mr. Scrimshaw has given just enough of the romantic charm of artistic enthusiasm to make it positively fascinating. There was a time when man did not know how to lay bricks, he says in his scholarly introductory chapter on The Ancient Art. A time when he did not know how to make bricks. There was a time when fortresses and cathedrals were unknown, and churches and residences were not to be seen on the face of the earth. But today we see wonderful architecture, noble and glorious structures, magnificent skyscrapers, and pretty homelike bungalows. To one who has been scouring Westchester County for the past 2 months looking at the structures which are being offered for sale as homes, pretty homelike bungalows comes as le mot juste. They certainly are no more than pretty homelike. One cannot read far in Mr. Scrimshaw's book without blushing for the inadequacy of modern education. We are turned out of our schools as educated young men and women, and yet what college graduate here tonight can tell me when the first brick in America was made? Or even where it was made, I thought not. Well, it was made in New Haven in 1650. Mr. Scrimshaw does not say what it was made for, but a conjecture would be that it was the handiwork of Yale students for tactical use in the Harvard game. Oh, I know that Yale wasn't running in 1650, but what difference does that make in an informal little article like this? It is getting so that a man can't make any statement at all without being caught up on it by some busybody or other. But let's get down to the art itself. Mr. Scrimshaw's first bit of advice is very sound. The bricklayer should first take a keen glance at the scaffolding upon which he is to work, to see that there is nothing broken or dangerous connected with it. This is essential, because more important than anything else to him is the preservation of his life and limb. Oh, Mr. Scrimshaw, how true that is! If I were a bricklayer, I would devote practically my whole morning inspecting the scaffolding on which I was to work. Whatever else I shirked, I would put my whole heart and soul into this part of my task. Every rope should be tested, every board examined, and I doubt if even then I would go up on the scaffold. Any bricks that I could not lay with my feet on terra firma, there's a joke somewhere about terracotta, but I'm busy now, could be laid by someone else. But we don't seem to be getting ahead in our instruction in practical bricklaying. Well, all right, take this. Pressed bricks, which are buttered, can be laid with a 1/8 inch joint, although a joint of 3/16 of an inch is to be preferred. Joe, get this gentleman a joint of 3/16 of an inch, buttered. Service, that's our motto. It takes a book like this to make a man realize what he misses in his everyday life. For instance, who would think that right here in New York there were people who specialized in corbelling? Rain or shine, hot or cold, you will find them corbelling around like Trojans. Or when they are not corbelling, they may be toothing. I, too, thought that this might be a misprint for teething, but it is spelled toothing throughout the book, so I guess that Mr. Scrimshaw knows what he is about. Of all departments of bricklaying, I should think that it would be more fun to tooth than to do anything else, but it must be tiring work. I suppose that many a bricklayer's wife has said to her neighbor, "I am having a terrible time with my husband this week. He is toothing, and comes home so cross and irritable that nothing suits him." Another thing that a bricklayer has to be careful of, according to the author, and I have no reason to contest his warning, is the danger of stepping on spalls. If there is one word that I would leave with the young bricklayer about to enter his trade, it is, beware of the spalls, my boy. They are insidious, those spalls are. You think you are all right, and then poof, or maybe crash would be a better descriptive word. Whatever noise is made by a spall when it is stepped on is the one I want. Perhaps spock would do. I would have to look up spall first, I guess. Well, anyway, there you have practical bricklaying in a nutshell. Of course, there are lots of other points in the book and some dandy pictures, and it would pay you to read it. But in case you haven't time, just skim over this resume again, and you will have the gist of it. Chapter 47. American Anniversaries. Mr. Philip R. Dillon has compiled and published, in his American Anniversaries, a book for men who do things. For every day in the year, there is a record of something which has been accomplished in American history. For instance, under January 1, we find that the parcel post system was inaugurated in the United States in 1913, while January 2nd is given as the anniversary of the Battle of Murfreesboro, or Stones River, as you prefer. The whole book is like that, just one surprise after another. What, for instance, do you suppose that Saturday marked the completion of? Presuming that no one has answered correctly, I will disclose, after consulting Mr. Dillon's book, that July 31st marked the completion of the 253rd year since the signing of the Treaty of Breda. And what you may say, and doubtless are saying at this very minute, what has the Treaty of Breda, which everyone knows was signed in Holland by representatives of England, France, Holland, and Denmark, got to do with American history? And right there is where Mr. Dillon and I would have you. In the Treaty of Breda, Acadia, or Nova Scotia, was given to France, and New York and New Jersey were confirmed to England. So you see, inhabitants of New York and New Jersey, and after all, who isn't, should have a special cause for celebrating July 31st as Breda Day, for if it hadn't been for that treaty, we might have belonged to Poland and have been mixed up in all the mess that is now going on over there. I must confess that I turned to the date of the anniversary of my own birth with no little expectation. Of course, I am not so very well known, except among the tradespeople in my town, but I should be willing to enter myself in a popularity contest with the Treaty of Breda. But evidently there is a conspiracy of silence directed against me on the part of the makers of anniversary books and calendars. While no mention was made of my having been born on September 15th, considerable space was given to recording the fact that on that date in 1840, a patent for a knitting machine was issued to the inventor, who was none other than Isaac Wixon Lamb of Salem, Massachusetts. Now, I would be the last one to belittle the importance of knitting or the invention of a knitting machine. I know some very nice people who knit a great deal, but really, when it comes to anniversaries, I don't see where Isaac Wixon Lamb gets off to crash in ahead of me or a great many other people that I could name. And it doesn't help any, either, to find that James Fenimore Cooper and William Howard Taft are both mentioned as having been born on that day, or that the chief basic patent for gasoline automobiles in America was issued in 1895 to George B. Selden. It certainly was a big day for patents, but one realizes more than ever after reading this section that you have to have a big name to get into an anniversary book. The average citizen has no show at all. In spite of these rather obvious omissions, Mr. Dillon's book is both valuable and readable. Especially in those events which occurred early in the country's history is there material for comparison with the happenings of the present day, events which will someday be incorporated in a similar book compiled by some energetic successor of Mr. Dillon. For instance, under October 27, 1659, we find that William Robinson and Marmaduke Stevenson were banished from New Hampshire on the charge of being Quakers, and were later executed for returning to the colony. Imagine. And on December 8, 1837, Wendell Phillips delivered his first abolition speech at Boston in Faneuil Hall, as a result of which he got himself known around Boston as an undesirable citizen, a dangerous radical, and a revolutionary troublemaker. It hardly seems possible now, does it? And on July 4th, 1776, but there, why rub it in? Chapter 48, A Weekend with Wells. In the February Bookman, there is an informal article by John Eliot called At Home with H.G. Wells, in which we are let in on the ground floor in the Wells household and shown H.G., as his friends and his wife call him, at play. It is an interesting glimpse at the small doings of a great man, but there is one feature of those doings which has an ominous sound. The Wells that everyone loves who sees him at Easton is the human Wells, the family Wells, the jovial Wells. Wells, the host of some Sunday afternoon party. For a distance of 10 or 20 miles round, folks come on Sunday to play hockey and have tea. Old and young, people from down London who never played hockey before in their lives, country farmers and their daughters, and everybody else who lives in the district. Troop over and bring whoever happens to be the weekend guest. Wells is delightful to them all. He doesn't give a rap if they are solid Tories, Bolsheviks, liberals, or men and women of no political leanings. Can you play hockey is all that matters. If you say no, you are rushed toward a pile of sticks and given one and told to go in the forward line. If you say yes, you are probably made a vice captain on the spot. I am frank to confess that this sounds perfectly terrible to me. I can't imagine a worse place in which to spend a weekend than one where your host is always boisterously forcing you to take part in games and dances about which you know nothing. A weekend guest ought to be ignored, allowed to rummage about alone among the books, livestock, and cold food in the icebox whenever he feels like it, and not rushed willy-nilly. Something good could be done using the famous willy-nilly correspondence as a base, but not here, into whatever the family itself may consider a good time. In such a household as the Wells household must be, you are greeted by your hostess in a robust manner with, "So glad you're on time, the match begins at 2." And when you say, "What match?" you are told that there is a little tennis tournament on for the weekend and that you and Hank are scheduled to start the thing off with a bang. "But I haven't played tennis for 5 years," you protest, thinking of the delightful privacy of your own little hall bedroom in town. "Never mind, it will all come back to you. Bill has got some extra things all put out for you upstairs." So you start off your weekend by making a dub of yourself and are known from that afternoon on by the people who didn't catch your name as the man who had such a funny serve. Or if it isn't that, it's dancing. Immediately after dinner, just as you are about to settle down for a comfortable evening by the fire, you notice that they are rolling back the rugs. House cleaning, you suggest with a nervous little laugh. Oh no, just a little dancing in your honor. And then you tell them that your honor will be satisfied perfectly without dancing, that you haven't danced since you left school, that you don't dance very well, or that you have hurt your foot, to which the only reply is an encouraging laugh and a hail fellow well met push out into the middle of the floor. A pox on both your house parties. And yet, in a way, that is just what one might expect from Mr. Wells. He has done the same thing to me in his books many a time. I personally have but little facility for world repairing. I haven't the slightest idea of how one would go about making things better. And yet, before I am more than 2/3 of the way through Joan and Peter, or The Undying Fire, or The Outline of History, Mr. Wells has me out on the hockey field, waving a stick with a magnificent enthusiasm, but no aim, rushing up and down and calling, "Come on now," to no one in particular. No matter how discouraging things seem when I pick up a Wells book, or how averse I may be to launching out on a crusade of any sort, I always end by walking with a firm step to the door, feeling somehow that I have grown quite a bit taller and much handsomer, and saying quietly, "Meadows, my suit of armor, please. The one with a chainmail shirt and a purple plume." This, of course, is silly, as any of Mr. Wells' critics will tell you. It is the effect that he has on irresponsible, visionary minds. But if all the irresponsible, visionary minds in the world become sufficiently belligerent through a continued reading of Mr. Wells, or even of the New Testament, who knows but what they may become just practical enough to take a hand at running things? They couldn't do much worse than the responsible, practical minds have done, now could they? Chapter 49. About Portland Cement. Portland cement is the finely pulverized product resulting from the calcination to incipient fusion of an intimate mixture of properly proportioned argillaceous and calcareous materials, and to which no addition greater than 3% has been made subsequent to calcination. That, in a word, is the keynote of H. Cullen Campbell's How to Use Cement for Concrete Construction. In case you should never read any more of the book, you would have that. But to the reader who is not satisfied with this taste of the secret of cement construction, and who reads on into Mr. Campbell's work, there is revealed a veritable mine of information, and in the light of the recent turn of events, one might even call it significant. Any turn of events will do. The first chapter is given over to a plea for concrete. Judging from the claims made for concrete by Mr. Campbell, it will accomplish everything that a return to Republican administration would do, and wouldn't be anywhere near so costly. It will make your barn fireproof. It will ensure clean milk for your children. It will provide a safe housing for your automobile. Farm prosperity and concrete go hand in hand. In case there are any other members of society who have been with me in thinking that Portland cement is a product of Portland, Maine, or Portland, Oregon, it might as well be stated right here and now that America had nothing to do with the founding of the industry, and that the lucky Portland is an island off the south coast of England. It was a bright sunny afternoon in May 1824 when Joseph Aspdin, an intelligent bricklayer of Leeds, England, was carelessly calcining a mixture of limestone and clay, as bricklayers often do on their days off, that he suddenly discovered, on reducing the resulting clinker to a powder, that this substance, on hardening, resembled nothing so much as the yellowish gray stone found in the quarries on the Isle of Portland. How Joe knew what grew on the Isle of Portland when his home was in Leeds is not explained. Maybe he spent his summers at the Portland House within 3 minutes of the bathing beach. At any rate, on discovering the remarkable similarity between the mess he had cooked up and Portland stone, he called to his wife and said, "Eunice, come here a minute. What does this remind you of?" The usually cheerful brow of Eunice Aspdin clouded for the fraction of a second. "That night at Bert and Edna's?" she ventured. "No, no, my dear," said the intelligent bricklayer, slightly irked. "Anyone could see that this here substance is a dead ringer for Portland stone, and I am going to make heaps and heaps of it and call it Portland cement. It is little enough that I can do for the old island." And so that's how Portland cement was named. Rumor hath it that the first Portland cement in America was made at Allentown, Pennsylvania, in 1875, but I wouldn't want to be quoted as having said that. But I will say that the total annual production in this country is now over 90 million barrels. It is interesting to note that cement is usually packed in cloth sacks, although sometimes paper bags are used. A charge is made for packing cement in paper bags, the book says. These, of course, are not redeemable. One can understand their not wanting to take back a paper bag in which cement had been wrapped. The wonder is that the bag lasts until you get home with it. I tried to take 6 cantaloupes home in a paper bag the other night and had a bad enough time of it. Cement, when it is in good form, must be much worse than cantaloupe, and the redeemable remnants of the bag must be negligible. But why charge extra for using paper bags? That seems like adding whatever it is you add to injury. Apologies rather than extra charge should be in order. However, I suppose that these cement people understand their business. I shall know enough to watch out, however, and insist on having whatever cement I may be called upon to carry home done up in a cloth sack. Not in a paper bag, if you please, I shall say very politely to the clerk. Chapter 50. Open Bookcases. Things have come to a pretty pass when a man can't buy a bookcase that hasn't got glass doors on it. What are we becoming, a nation of weaklings? All over New York City I have been trying to get something in which to keep books. And what am I shown? Curio cabinets, enclosed whatnots, museum cases in which to display fragments from the Neolithic age, and glass-faced sarcophagi for dead butterflies. "But I am apt to use my books at any time," I explained to the salesman. "I never can tell when it is coming on me. And when I want a book, I want it quickly. I don't want to have to send down to the office for the key, and I don't want to have to manipulate any trick ball bearings and open up a case as if I were getting cream puffs out for a customer. I want a bookcase for books, and not books for a bookcase." I really don't say all those clever things to the clerk. It took me quite a while to think them up. What I really say is, timidly, "Haven't you any bookcases without glass doors?" And when they say no, I thank them and walk into the nearest dining room table. But if they keep on getting arrogant about it, I shall speak up to them one of these fine days. When I ask for an open-faced bookcase, they look with a scornful smile across the salesroom toward the mahogany 4 posters and say, "Oh, no, we don't carry those anymore. We don't have any call for them. Everyone uses the glass-doored ones now. They keep the books much cleaner." Then the ideal procedure for a real book lover would be to keep his books in the original box, snugly packed in excelsior, with the lid nailed down. Then they would be nice and clean, and the sun couldn't get at them and ruin the bindings. Faugh! Try saying that. It doesn't work out as well as you think it's going to. and it makes you feel very silly for having tried it. Why, in the elder days, bookcases with glass doors were owned only by people who filled them with 10 volumes of a pictorial history of the Civil War, including some swell steel engravings, Walks and Talks with John L. Stoddard, and Daily Thoughts for Daily Needs, done in robin's egg blue with a watered silk bookmark dangling out. A set of Sir Walter Scott always helps fill out a bookcase with glass doors. It looks well from the front and shows that you know good literature when you see it. And you don't have to keep opening and shutting the doors to get it out, for you never want to get it out. A bookcase with glass doors used to be a sign that somewhere in the room there was a crayon portrait of Father when he was a young man, with a real piece of glass stuck on the portrait to represent a diamond stud. And now we are told that everyone buys bookcases with glass doors. We have no call for others. Soon we shall be told that the thing to do is to buy the false backs of bindings, such as they have in stage libraries, to string across behind the glass. It will keep us from reading too much, and then, too, no one will want to borrow our books. But one clerk told me the truth, and I am just fearless enough to tell it here. I know that it will kill my chances for the presidency, but I cannot stop to think of that. After advising me to have a carpenter build me the kind of bookcase I wanted, and after I told him that I had my name in for a carpenter but wasn't due to get him until late in the fall, and he was waiting for prices to go higher before taking the job on, the clerk said, "That's it. It's the price. You see, the furniture manufacturers can make much more money out of a bookcase with glass doors than they can without. When, by hanging glass doors on a piece of furniture at but little more expense to themselves, they can get a much bigger profit, what's the sense in making them without glass doors? They have just stopped making them, that's all." So you see, the American people are being practically forced into buying glass doors, whether they want them or not. Is that right? Is it fair? Where is our personal liberty going to? What is becoming of our traditional American institutions? I don't know. This concludes Part 10 of Love Conquers All by Robert C. Benchley, read by Ted DeLorme for LibriVox. This book will continue on future files. The LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ted DeLorme in Fort Mill, South Carolina during July and August 2006. Love Conquers All by Robert C. Benchley. Chapter 51. Trout Fishing. I never knew very much about trout fishing anyway, and I certainly had no inkling that a trout fisher had to be so deceitful until I read Trout Fishing in Brooks by G. Garrowgreen. The thing is appalling. Evidently, the sport is nothing but a constant series of compromises with one's better nature. What with sneaking about pretending to be something that one is not, trying to fool the fish into thinking one thing when just the reverse is true, and in general behaving in an underhanded and tricky manner throughout the day. The very first, and evidently the most important exhortation in the book is, "Whatever you do, keep out of sight of the fish." Is that open and above board? Is it honorable? Trout invariably lie in running water with their noses pointed against the current, and therefore whatever general chance of concealment there may be rests in fishing from behind them. The moral is that the brook angler must both walk and fish upstream. It seems as if a lot of trouble might be saved the fisherman in case he really didn't want to walk upstream but had to get to some point downstream before 6 o'clock, to adopt some disguise which would deceive the fish into thinking that he had no intention of catching them anyway. A pair of blue glasses and a cane would give the effect of the wearer being blind and harmless, and could be thrown aside very quickly when the time came to show oneself in one's true colors to the fish. If there were two anglers, they might talk in loud tones about their dislike for fish in any form, and then, when the trout were quite reassured and swimming close to the bank, they could suddenly be shot with a pistol. But a little further on comes a suggestion for a much more elaborate bit of subterfuge. The author says that in the early season trout are often engaged with larvae at the bottom and do not show on the surface. It is then a good plan, he says, to sink the flies well, moving in short jerks to imitate nymphs. You can see that imitating a nymph will call for a lot of rehearsing, but I doubt very much if moving in short jerks is the way in which to go about it. I have never actually seen a nymph, though if I had I should not be likely to admit it, and I can think of no possible way in which I could give an adequate illusion of being one myself. Even the most stupid of trout could easily divine that I was masquerading, and then the question would immediately arise in its mind: if he is not a nymph, then what is his object in going about like that trying to imitate one? He is up to no good, I'll be bound. And crash, away would go the trout before I could put my clothes back on. There is an interesting note on the care and feeding of worms on page 67. 150 worms are placed in a tin and allowed to work their way down into packed moss. A little fresh milk poured in occasionally is sufficient food, writes Mr. Garrow Green in the style of Dr. Holt. So disposed, the worms soon become bright, lively, and tough. It is easy to understand why one should want to have bright worms, so long as they don't know that they are bright and try to show off before company, but why deliberately set out to make them tough? Good manners they may not be expected to acquire, but a worm with a cultivated vulgarity sounds intolerable. Imagine 150 very tough worms all crowded together in one tin. Canaille is the only word to describe it. I suppose that it is my ignorance of fishing parlance which makes the following sentence a bit hazy. Much has been written about bringing a fish downstream to help drown it, as no doubt it does. Still, this is often impracticable. I can think of nothing more impracticable than trying to drown a fish under any conditions, upstream or down, but I suppose that Mr. Garrow Green knows what he is talking about. And in at least one of his passages I follow him perfectly. In speaking of the time of day for fly fishing in the spring, he says, "Carpe diem is a good watchword when trout are in the humor." At least, I know a good pun when I see one. Chapter 52. Scouting for Girls. Scouting for Girls is not the kind of book you think it is. The verb to scout is intransitive in this case. As a matter of fact, instead of being a volume of advice to men on how to get along with girls, it is full of advice to girls on how to get along without men. That is, within reason, of course. It is issued by the Girl Scouts and is very subtle anti-man propaganda. I can't find that men are mentioned anywhere in the book. It is given over entirely to telling girls how to chop down trees, tie knots in ropes, and things like that. Now, as a man, I am very jealous of my man's prerogative of chopping down trees and tying knots in ropes. And I resent the teaching of young girls to usurp my province in these matters. Any young girl who has taken one lesson in knot tying will be able to make me appear very silly at it. After 2 lessons, she could tie me hand and foot to a tree and go away with my watch and commutation ticket. And then I would look fine, wouldn't I? Small wonder to me that I hail the Girl Scout movement as a menace and urge its being nipped in the bud as you would nip a viper in the bud. I would not be surprised if there were Russian Soviet money back of it somewhere. A companion volume to Scouting for Girls is Campward Ho, a manual for Girl Scout camps. The keynote is sounded on the first page by a quotation from Chaucer, beginning, "When that April with its showers swoot, the drought of March hath pierced to the root, and batheth every vein in sweet liquor, of which virtue engendered is the fleur." One can almost hear the girls singing that of an evening as they sit around the campfire tying knots in ropes. It is really an ideal camping song, because even the littlest girls can sing the words without understanding what they mean. But it really lacks the lilt of the marching song printed further on in the book. This is to be sung to the tune of "Where Do We Go From Here, Boys?" Bear this in mind while humming it to yourself. And the song is even personalized, so that on the second line where we say "Our Captain," you insert the captain's name. I'll use Mary. Marching song. Where do we go from here, girls? Where do we go from here? Anywhere our Captain Mary leads, we'll follow, never fear. The world is full of dandy girls, but wait till we appear. Then, Girl Scouts, give us a hearty cheer. A very stirring marching song, without doubt. But what would they do if the leader's name happened to be something like Mary Louise Abercrombie or Elizabeth Vanderwater? They just couldn't have a captain with such a long name, that's all. And there you have unfair discrimination creeping into your camp right at the start. In Scouting for Girls, there is some useful information concerning smoke signals. In case you are lost or want to communicate with your friends who are beyond shouting distance, it is much quicker than telephoning to build a clear, hot fire and cover it with green stuff or rotten wood so that it will send up a solid column of black smoke. By spreading and lifting a blanket over this smudge, the column can be cut up into pieces, long or short. This is the way it explains it in the book, but it doesn't sound plausible to me. And by a preconcerted code, these can be made to convey tidings. For instance, 1 steady smoke means "Here is camp." 2 steady smokes means "I am lost. Come and help me." 3 smokes in a row mean "Good news." I suppose that the Pollyanna of the camping party is constantly sending up 3 smokes in a row on the slightest provocation. And then when the rest of the outfit have raced across country for miles to find out what the good news is, she probably shows them with great enthusiasm that some French gentians are already in blossom or that the flicker's eggs have hatched. Unfortunately, there is no smoke code given for snappy replies, but in the next paragraph it tells how to carry on a conversation with pistol shots. One of these would serve the purpose for repartee. Chapter 53. How to Sell Goods. The Retail Merchants Association ought to buy up all the copies of Elements of Retail Salesmanship by Paul Westley Ivy, Macmillan, and not let a single one get into the hands of a customer. For once the buying public reads what is written there, the game is up. It tells all about how to sell goods to people, how to appeal to their weaknesses, how to exert subtle influences which will win them over in spite of themselves. Houdini might as well issue a pamphlet giving in detail his methods of escape as for the merchants of this country to let this book remain in circulation. The art of salesmanship is founded, according to Mr. Ivy, on, first, a thorough knowledge of the goods which are to be sold, and second, a knowledge of the customer. By knowing the customer, you know what line of argument will most appeal to him. There are several lines in popular use. First is the appeal to the instinct of self-preservation, i.e., social self-preservation. The customer is made to feel that, in order to preserve her social standing, she must buy the article in question. She must be made to feel what a disparaged social self would mean to her mental comfort. It is reassuring to know that it is a recognized ruse on the part of the salesman to intimate that unless you buy a particular article, you will have to totter through life branded as the arch piker. I have always taken this attitude of the clerks perfectly seriously. In fact, I have worried quite a bit about it. In the store where I am allowed to buy my clothes, it is quite the thing among the salesmen to see which one of them can degrade me the most. They intimate that, while they have no legal means of refusing to sell their goods to me, it really would be much more in keeping with things if I were to take the few pennies that I have at my disposal and run around the corner to some little haberdashery for my shirts and ties. Every time I come out from that store, I feel like Ethel Barrymore in Déclassé. Much worse, in fact, for I haven't any good looks to fall back upon. But now that I know the clerks are simply acting all that scorn in an attempt to appeal to my instinct for the preservation of my social self, I can face them without flinching. When that pompous old boy with the sandy mustache, who has always looked upon me as a member of the degenerate Juke family, tries to tell me that if I don't take the $5 cravat, he won't be responsible for the way in which decent people will receive me when I go out on the street, I will reach across the counter and playfully pull his own necktie out from his waistcoat and scream, "I know you, you old rascal! You got that stuff from page 68 of Elements of Retail Salesmanship." Macmillan. Other traits which a salesperson may appeal to in the customer are vanity, parental pride, greed, imitation, curiosity, and selfishness. One really gets in touch with a lot of nice people in this work, and can bring out the very best that is in them. Customers are divided into groups indicative of temperament. There is first the impulsive or nervous customer. She is easily recognized because she walks into the store in a quick, sometimes jerky manner. Her eyes are keen-looking, her expression is intense, oftentimes appearing strained. She must be approached promptly, according to the book, and what she desires must be quickly ascertained. Since these are the rules for selling to people who enter the store in this manner, it might be well, no matter how lethargic you may be by nature, to assume the appearance of the impulsive or nervous customer as soon as you enter the store, adopting a quick, even jerky manner, and making your eyes as keen-looking as possible, with an intense expression, oftentimes appearing strained. Then the clerk will size you up as type number 1 and will approach you promptly. After she has quickly filled your order, you may drop the impulsive pose and assume your natural, slow manner again, whereupon the clerk will doubtless be highly amused at having been so cleverly fooled into giving quick service. The opposite type is known as the deliberate customer. She walks slowly and in a dignified manner. Her facial expression is calm and poised. Gestures are uncommon, but if existing, tend to be slow and inconspicuous. She can wait. Then there is the vacillating or indecisive customer, the confident or decisive customer. This one should be treated with subtle flattery and agreement with all her views. The talkative or friendly customer, and the silent or indifferent one. All these have their little weaknesses, and the perfect salesperson will learn to know these and play to them. There seems to be only one thing left for the customer to do in order to meet this concerted attack upon his personality. That is, to hire some expert like Mr. Ivy to study the different types of salesmen and women and formulate methods of meeting their offensive. Thus, if I am of the type designated as the vacillating or indecisive customer, I ought to know what to do when confronted by a salesman of the aristocratic, scornful type, so that I may not be bulldozed into buying something I do not want. If I could only find such a book of instructions, I would go tomorrow and order a black cotton engineer's shirt from that sandy mustached salesman and bawl him out if he raised his eyebrows. But, not having the book, I shall go in and, without a murmur, buy a $3 silk shirt for $18 and slink out, feeling that if I had been any kind of sport at all, I would also have bought that cork helmet in the showcase. Chapter 54. You. In the window of the grocery store to which I used to be sent after a pound of mocha and Java mixed and a dozen of your best oranges, there was a cardboard figure of a clerk in a white coat, pointing his finger at the passers-by. As I remember, he was accusing you of not taking home a bottle of Moxie, and pretty guilty it made you feel, too. This man was, I believe, the pioneer in what has since become a great literary movement. He founded the You, Mr. Businessman School of Direct Appeal. It is strictly an advertising property and has long been used to sell merchandise to people who never can resist the flattery of being addressed personally. When used as an advertisement, it is usually accompanied by an illustration built along the lines of the pioneer grocery clerk, pointing a virile finger at you from the page of the magazine, and putting the whole thing on a personal basis by addressing you as "You, Mr. Rider in the Open Cars," or "You, Mr. Wearer of size 14 shirts." The appeal is instantaneous. In straight reading matter, bound in book form and sold as literature, this Moxie talk becomes a volume of inspirational sermonizing, and instead of selling cooling drinks or warming applications, it throws dynamic paragraph after dynamic paragraph into the fight for efficiency, concentration, self-confidence, and personality on the part of our body politic. A homely virtue such as was taught us at our mother's knee, or across our mother's knees, at the age of 4 in a dozen or so simple words, is taken and blown up into a book in which it is stated very impressively in a series of short, snappy sentences, all saying the same thing. Such a book is called, for instance, You, written by Irving R. Allen. You takes 275 pages to divulge a secret of success. It would not be fair to Mr. Allen to give it away here after he has spent so much time concealing it, but it might be possible to give some idea of the importance of Mr. Allen's discovery by stating one of my own, somewhat in the manner in which he has stated his. I will give my little contribution to the world's inspiration the title of Hey, You! You and I are alone. No, don't try to get away. That door is locked. I won't hurt you. Much. Now what I want to do is make you see yourself. I want you, when you put down this book, to say, I know myself. I want you to be able to look at yourself in the mirror and say, "Why, certainly I remember you, Mr. Addington Sims of Seattle, you old Rotary Club dog. How's your merger?" And the only way that you can ever be able to do this is to read this book through. Then read it through again. Then read it through again. Then ring Dorothy's bell and ask for Chester. Now let's get down to business. I knew a man once who had made $1 million. If he hadn't been arrested, he would have made another million. Do you see what I mean? If not, go back and read that over a second time. It's worth it. I wrote it for you to read. You! Do you hear me? You! If you want to know the secret of this man's success, of the success of hundreds of other men just like him, if you want to make his success your success, you must first learn the rule. What is this rule, you may ask? Go ahead and ask it. Very well, since you ask, it is a rule which has kept J.P. Morgan what he is. It is a rule which gives John D. Rockefeller the right to be known as the Baptist man alive. It is a rule which is responsible for the continued existence of every successful man of today. And now I am going to tell it to you. You, the you that you know, the real you, are going to learn the secret. Can you bear it? Here it is. You can't win if you breathe underwater. Read that again. Read it backward. It may sound simple to you now. You may say to yourself, "What do you take me for, a baby boy?" Well, you paid good money for this book, didn't you? Chapter 55. The Catalog School. Without wishing in the least to detract from the praise due to Sinclair Lewis for the remarkable accuracy with which he reports details in his Main Street, it is interesting to speculate on how other books might have read had their authors had Mr. Lewis's flair for minutiae and their publishers enough paper to print the result. For instance, Carol Kennicott, the heroine, whenever she is overtaken by an emotional scene, is given to looking out at the nearest window to hide her feelings, whereupon the author goes to great lengths to describe just exactly what came within her range of vision. Nothing escapes him, even to shreds of excelsior lying on the ground in back of Howland and Gould's grocery store. Let us suppose that Harriet Beecher Stowe had been endowed with Mr. Lewis's gift for reporting, and had indulged herself in it to the extent of the following in Uncle Tom's Cabin. Slowly Simon Legree raised his whip arm to strike the prostrate body of the old negro. As he did so his eye wandered across the plantation to the slaves' quarters, which crouched blistering in the sun. Cowed as they were, as only ramshackle buildings can be cowed, they presented their gray boards, each eaten with 4 or 5 knotholes, to the elements in abject submission. The door of one hung loose by a rust-encaged hinge, of which only one screw remained on duty, and that by sheer will-power of 2 or 3 threads. Legree could not quite make out how many threads there were on the screw, but he guessed, and Simon Legree's guess was nearly always right. On the ground at the threshold lay a banjo G-string, curled like a blond snake, ready to strike at the reddish-brown inner husk of a nut of some sort which was blowing about within reach. There were also several crumbs of corn-pone, well done, a shred of tobacco which had fallen from the pipe of some negro slave before the fire had consumed more than its very tip, an old shoe which had, Legree noticed by the maker's name, been bought in Boston in its palmier days, doubtless by a Yankee cousin of one of Uncle Tom's former owners, and an indiscriminate pile of old second editions of a Richmond newspaper, sweet potato peelings, and seeds of unripe watermelons. Swish! The blow descended on the crouching form of Uncle Tom, or Sir Walter Scott. Sadly, Rowena turned from her lover's side and looked out over the courtyard of the castle. Beneath her she saw the cobblestones all scratched and marred with gray bruises from the horses' hoofs. A faded purple ribbon dropped from the mandolin of a minstrel. 3 slightly imperfect wassails, and a trencher with a nick on the rim, all that had not been used of the wild boar at last night's feast. A peach stone like a wrinkled almond nestling in a sardine tin. Slowly she faced her knight. "Prithee," she said, and I am not at all sure that Uncle Tom's Cabin and Ivanhoe wouldn't have made better reading if they had lapsed into the photographic at times. Mr. Lewis may overdo it, but I expect to reread Main Street some day, and that is more encouragement than I can hold out to Mrs. Stowe or Sir Walter Scott. This concludes Part 11 of Love Conquers All by Robert C. Benchley, read for LibriVox by Ted DeLorme. This book will continue on future files. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ted DeLorme in Fort Mill, South Carolina during July and August 2006. Love Conquers All by Robert C. Benchley. Chapter 56, Effective House Organs. To the hurrying commuter as he waits for his 2-cents change at the newsstand, it looks as if all the periodicals in the United States were on display there, none of which he ever has quite time enough to buy. It seems incredible that there should be presses enough in the country to print all the matter that he sees hanging from wires, piled on the counter, and dangling from clips over the edge, to say nothing of his conceiving of there being other periodicals in circulation which he never even hears about. But anyone knowing the commuter well enough to call him dearie might tell him in slightly worn vernacular that he doesn't know the half of it. One cannot get a true idea of the amount of sideline printing that is done in this country without reading Effective House Organs, written by Robert E. Ramsay. The mass effect of this book is appalling. Page after page of clear-cut illustrations show reproductions of hundreds and hundreds of house organ covers, and give the reader a hopeless sensation of going down for the 3rd time. Such names as Gas Logic, Craning, Hidden's Hints, the Y&E Idea, Vim, Tick-Tock, and the Smilage show that Yankee ingenuity has invaded the publishing field, which means that the literature of business is on its way to becoming the literature of the land. For those who are so illiterate as not to be familiar with the literature of business, I quote a definition of the word house organ. A house magazine or bulletin to dealers, customers, or employees designed to promote goodwill, increase sales, induce better salesmanship, or develop better profits. In spite of Mr. Ramsay's exceedingly thorough treatment of his subject, there is one type of house organ to which he devotes much too little space. This is the so-called employee or internal house organ, and is designed to keep the help happy and contented with their lot, and to spur them on to extra effort in making it a banner year for the stockholders. The possibilities of this sort of house organ in the solution of the problem of industrial unrest are limitless. Publications for light reading among employees are usually called by such titles as Dibbly Doings, Tinkham Topics, The Mooney and Carmichael Machine Lather, or Better Belting News. First of all, they carry news notes of happenings among the employees so that a real spirit of cooperation and team play may be fostered. These news notes include such as the following. Eddie Lingard of the Screen Room Force was observed last Saturday evening between the mystic hours of 6:30 with a certain party from the shipping room, said party in a tan knit sweater, on their way to Ollie's. Come, fess up, Eddie. Everyone is wondering who the person is who put chocolate peppermints in some of the girls' pockets while they were hanging in the girls' restroom Thursday afternoon, it being so hot that they melted and practically ruined some of their clothing. Some folks have a funny sense of humor. Then there are excerpts from speeches made by the Reverend Charles Aubrey Eaton and young Mr. Rockefeller, or by the president and treasurer of the Diamond Motor Sales Corporation, saying in part, "The man who makes good in any line of work is the man who gives the best there is in him. He doesn't watch the clock. He doesn't kick when he fails to get that raise that he may have expected. He just digs into the job harder and makes the dust fly. And when someone comes along waving a red flag and tries to make him stop work and strike for more money, he turns on the agitator and says, 'You get the H out of here. I know my job better than you do. I know my boss better than you do, and I know that he is going to give me the square deal just as soon as he can see his way clear to do it. And in the meantime, I am going to work.' That is the kind of man who makes good." And then there are efficiency contests, with the force divided into teams, trying to see which one can wrap the most containers or stamp the largest number of covers in the week. The winning team gets a felt banner, and their names are printed in full in that week's issue of Pep or Nosy News. And biographies of employees who have been with the company for more than 50 years, with photographs, and a little notice written by the superintendent saying that this will show the company's appreciation of Mr. Gomble's loyal and unswerving allegiance to his duty, implying that anyone else who does his duty for 50 years will also get his picture in the paper and a notice by the superintendent. It will easily be seen how this sort of house organ can be made to promote good feeling and esprit de corps among the help. If only more concerns could be prevailed upon to bring this message of weekly or monthly good cheer to their employees, who knows but what the whole cauldron of industrial unrest might not suddenly simmer down to mere nothingness. It has been said that all that is necessary is for capital and labor to understand each other. Certainly such a house organ helps the employees to understand their employers. Perhaps someone will start a house organ edited by the employees for circulation among the bosses, containing newsy notes about the owners' families, quotations from Karl Marx, and the results of the profit-sharing contest between the various mills of the district. This would complete the circle of understanding. Chapter 57. Advice to Writers. 2 books have emerged from the hundreds that are being published on the art of writing. One of them is The Lure of the Pen by Flora Klickman, and the other is Learning to Write, a collection of Stevenson's meditations on the subject issued by Scribner's. At first glance, one might say that the betting would be at least 8-1 on Stevenson, But for real, solid, sensible advice in the matter of writing and selling stories in the modern market, Miss Klickmann romps in an easy winner. It must be admitted that John William Rogers, Jr., who collected the Stevenson material, warns the reader in his introduction that the book is not intended to serve as a macadamized, mile-posted road to the secret of writing, but simply as a help to those who want to write and who are interested to know how Stevenson did it. So we mustn't compare it too closely with Miss Klickmann's book, which is quite frankly a mile-posted road with little subheadings along the side of the page, such as we used to have in Fisk's Elementary American History. But Miss Klickmann will save the editors of the country a great deal more trouble than Stevenson's advice ever will. She is the editor of an English magazine herself, and has suffered. Where Miss Klickmann enumerates the pitfalls which the candidate must avoid and points out qualities which every good piece of writing should have, Stevenson writes a delightful essay on the profession of letters, or a gossip on romance. These essays are very inspiring. They are too inspiring. They make the reader feel that he can go out and write like Stevenson, and then a lot of 2-cent stamps are wasted and a lot more editors are cross when they get home at night. On the other hand, the result of Miss Klickmann's book is to make the reader who feels a writing spell coming on stop and give pause. He finds enumerated among the horrors of manuscript reading several items which he was on the point of injecting into his own manuscript with considerable pride. He may decide that the old job in the shipping room isn't so bad after all, with its little envelope coming in regularly every week. As a former member of the local Manuscript Readers' Union, I will give one of 3 rousing cheers for any good work that Miss Klickmann may do in this field. One writer kept very busy at work in the shipping room every day is a victory for literature. I used to have a job in a shipping room myself, so I know. If, for instance, the subject under discussion were that of learning to skate, Miss Klickmann might advise as follows. 1. Don't try to skate if your ankles are weak. 2. Get skates that fit you. A skate which can't be put on when you get to the pond, or one which drags behind your foot by the strap, is worse than no skate at all. 3. If you are sure that you are ready, get on your feet and skate. On the same subject, scribners might bring to light something that Stevenson had written to a young friend about to take his first lesson in skating, reading as follows. To know the secret of skating is, indeed, I have always thought, the beginning of winter-long pleasance. It comes as sweet deliverance from the tedium of indoor isolation and brings exhilaration, now with a swift glide to the right, now with a deft swerve to the left, now with a deep breath of healthy air, now with a long exhalation of ozone, which the lungs, like greedy misers, have cast aside after draining it of its treasure. But it is not health that we love, nor exhilaration that we seek, though we may think so. Our design and our sufficient reward is to verify our own existence, say what you will. And so, my dear young friend, I would say to you, open up your heart. Sing as you skate. Sing inharmoniously if you will, but sing. A man may skate with all the skill in the world. He may glide forward with incredible deftness and curve backward with divine grace. And yet, if he be not master of his emotions as well as of his feet, I would say, and here fate steps in, that he has failed. There is, of course, plenty of good advice in the Stevenson book, but it is much better as pure reading matter than as advice to the young idea, or even the middle-aged idea. It may have been all right for Stevenson to play the sedulous ape and consciously imitate the style of Hazlitt, Lamb, Montaigne, and the rest, but if the rest of us were to try it, there would result a terrible plague of insufferably artificial and affected authors, all playing the sedulous ape, and all looking the part. On the whole, the Stevenson book makes good reading, and Miss Klickmann gives good advice. Chapter 58: The Effective Speaking Voice. Joseph A. Mosher begins his book on the effective speaking voice by saying, "Among the many developments of the Great War was a widespread activity in public speaking." Mr. Mosher, to adopt a technical term of elocution, has said a mouthful. Whatever else the war did for us, it raised overnight an army of public speakers among the civilian population, many of whom seem not yet to have received their discharge. It is the aim of Mr. Mosher's book to keep this landwehr in fighting trim and aid in recruiting its ranks, possibly against the next war. Until every nation on earth has subjected its public speakers to a devastating operation on the larynx, no true disarmament can be said to have taken place. In the first place, there are exercises which must be performed by the man who would have an effective speaking voice, exercises similar to Walter Camp's Daily Dozen. You stand erect with the chest held moderately high. Moderation in all things is the best rule to follow, no matter what you are doing. Place the thumbs just above the hips, with the fingers forward over the waist to note the muscular action. Then you inhale and exhale and make the sound of ah and the sound of ah, ooh, oh. And if you aren't self-conscious, you say wah, wah, wee, wah slowly 10 or a dozen times. The student should stop at once if signs of dizziness appear, says the book, but it does not say whether these symptoms are to be looked for in the student himself or in the rest of the family. The author does the public a rather bad turn when he suggests to student speakers that, under stress, they might use what is known as the orotund. The orotund quality in public speaking is saved for passages containing grandeur of thought, when the orator feels the need of a larger, fuller, more resonant and sounding voice to be in keeping with the sentiment. Its effect is somewhat that of a chant, and here is how you do it. The chest is raised and tensed. The cavities of the mouth and pharynx are enlarged. More breath is directed into the nasal chambers, and the lips are opened more widely to give free passage to the increased volume of voice. The effectiveness of the orotund might be somewhat reduced if the audience knew the conscious mechanical processes which went to make it up, or if in the Congressional Record, instead of laughter and applause, the vocal technique of the orator could be indicated, how few would be the wars into which impassioned senators could plunge us. For example, Mr. Thurston's plea for intervention in Cuba. "The time for action has come," tensing the chest. "No greater reason for it can exist tomorrow than exists today," enlarging the cavities of the mouth. "Every hour's delay only adds another chapter to the awful story of misery and death," enlarging the cavities of the pharynx. "Only one power can intervene, the United States of America," directing more breath into the nasal chambers. "Ours is the one great nation of the New World. the mother of republics, elevating the diaphragm. We cannot refuse to accept this responsibility which the God of the universe has placed upon us as the one great power of the New World. We must act, raising the tongue and thrusting it forward so that the edges of the blade are pressed against the upper grinders. What shall our action be? Lifting the voice box very high and the edges of the tongue blade against the soft palate, leaving only a small central groove for the passage of air. The aspirate quality, or whisper, is very effective when well handled, and the book gives a few exercises for practice's sake. Try whispering a few of them if you are sure that you are alone in the room. You will sound very silly if you are overheard. I can't tell just how it happened. I think the beam fell on me. Keep back. Wait till I see if the coast is clear. Ask the man next to you if he'll let me see his program. Hark! What was that? It's too steep. He'll never make it. Oh, this is terrible. For the cheery evening's reading, if you happen to be feeling low in your mind, let me recommend that section of The Effective Speaking Voice, which deals with the subdued range. The selections for the practice reading include the following well-known nuggets in lighter vein: The Wounded Soldier, The Death of Molly Cass, The Little Cripple's Garden, The Burial of Little Nell, The Light of Other Days, The Baby is Dead, King David Mourns for Absalom, and The Days That Are No More. After all, a good laugh never does anyone any harm. Chapter 59. Those Dangerously Dynamic British Girls. It is difficult to get into Rose Macaulay's Dangerous Ages once you discover that it is going to be about another one of those offensively healthy English families. Ever since Mr. Britling, we have been deluged with accounts from overseas of whole droves of British brothers and sisters, mothers and fathers, grandfathers and grandmothers, who all get out at 6 in the morning and play hockey all over the place. Each has some strange intimate name like Bim or Pleda or Goots, and you can never tell which are the brothers and which are the sisters until they begin to have children along in the 10th or 11th chapter. In Dangerous Ages, they swim. Dozens of them, all in the same family, go splashing in at once and persist in calling out health slogans to one another across the waves. There are Neville and Rodney and Gerda and Kay, and one or two very old ladies whose relationship to the rest of the clan is never very definitely established. Grandma, for some reason or other, doesn't go in swimming that day, doubtless because she had already been in before breakfast and her suit wasn't dry. These dynamic British girls are always full of ruddy health and current information. They go about kidding each other on the second reading of the Home Rule Bill, or fooling in their girlish way about the chances of the Labour candidate in the coming Doncastershire elections. It is getting so that no novel of British life will be complete without somewhere in its pages a scene like the following. A chance visitor at the Beetles some autumn morning along about 5 o'clock might have been surprised to see a trail of dog-trotting figures winding their way heatedly across the meadow. No one but a chance visitor would be surprised, however, for it was well known to invited guests that the entire Willett family ran cross-country down to the outskirts of London and back every morning before breakfast, a matter of 14 miles. In the lead was, of course, Dungeon in running costume, followed closely by the flaxen-haired Mid and snub-nosed Boolah, then Arlix and Linny, striving valiantly for fourth place, but not reckoning on the fleet-footed Mida, who was no longer content to hobble in the vanguard with Grandpa Willits and Grandpa's old mother, who still insisted on cross-country running, although she had long since been put on the retired list at the club. "Oh, Linny!" called out Dungeon over her shoulder. "You young minx! Why didn't you tell us that you were reading a paper on birth control at the next meeting of the Spiddics? Twiller just told me today. It's too ripping of you." "Silly goose," panted Linny, stumbling over a hedgerow. "How about what the vicar said the other night about your inferiority complex? It was toppo, and you know it." "It won't be long now before we'll have disenfranchisement through, anyway," muttered Grandpa Willits, crashing down into a stone quarry, at which exhibition of reaction a loud chorus of laughter went up from the entire family, who by this time had reached Nograton and were bursting with health. This concludes Section 12 of Love Conquers All by Robert C. Benchley. Read by Ted DeLorme for LibriVox. This book will conclude on the next file. LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Ted DeLorme in Fort Mill, South Carolina, during July and August 2006. Love Conquers All by Robert C. Benchley. Chapter 60. Books and Other Things. For those to whom the purple and gold filigreed covers of Florence L. Barclay's books bring a stirring of the sap and a fluttering of the susceptible heart, Returned Empty comes as a languorous relief from the stolid realism of most present-day writing. One reads it and swoons, and on opening one's eyes again, one hears old family retainers murmuring in soft, retentive accents, "Here, sip some of this, my lord. 'Twill bring the roses back to those cheeks, and the strength to those poor limbs." It's elegant. That's all there is to it. Elegant. Returned Empty was the inscription on the wrappings which enfolded the tiny but aristocratic form of a man-child left on the steps of the Foundlings Institution one moonless October night. There was also some reference to Luke chapter 12, verse 6, which in return refers to 5 sparrows sold for 2 farthings. What more natural, then, than for the matron to name the little one Luke Sparrow? Luke was an odd boy, but refined, so odd that he used to go about looking in at people's windows when they forgot to pull down the shades, and so refined that he never wished to be inside with them. But one night, when he was 30 years old, he looked in at the window of a very refined and elegant mansion and saw a woman. In the simple words of the author, "In court or cottage alike, she would be queen." That's the kind of woman she was. And what do you think? She saw Luke looking in. Not only saw him, but came over to the window and told him that she had been expecting him. Well, you could have knocked Luke over with a feather. However, he allowed himself to be ushered in by the butler, everything in the house was elegant like that, and up to a room where he found evening clothes, bath salts, and grand things of that nature. On passing a box of books which stood in the hall, he read the name on it before he realized what he was doing. Of course, the minute he thought what an unrefined thing it was to do, he stopped. But it was too late. he had already seen that his hostess's name was Lady Tintagel. When later he met her down in the luxurious dining room, she was just as refined as ever, and so was he. They both were so refined that she had to tell the butler to serve the fruit in the oak room, Thomas. Once in the oak room, she told him her strange tale. It seemed that he was her husband. He didn't remember it, but he was. He had been drowned some years before, and she had wished so hard that he might come back to life that finally he had been born again in the body of Luke Sparrow. It's funny how things work out like that sometimes. But Luke, who, as has been said before, was an odd boy, took it very hard and said that he didn't want to be brought back to life. Not even when she told him that his name was now Sir Nigel Guido Cadros Tintagel, Bart. He became very cross and said that he was going to drown himself all over again, just to show her that she shouldn't have gone meddling with his spirit life. He was too refined to say so, but when you consider that he was just 30 and his wife, owing to the difference in time between the spirit world and this, had gone on growing old until she was now pushing 60, he had a certain amount of justice on his side. But of course she was Lady Tintagel, and all the lovers of Florence Barclay will understand that that is something. So, after reciting Tennyson's Crossing the Bar at her request, credit is given in the front of the book for the use of this poem, and only rightly, too, for without it the story could never have been written. He goes out into the ocean. But there, we mustn't give too much of the plot away. All that one need know is that Luke, or Sir Nigel, as you wish, and what reader of Florence Barclay wouldn't prefer Sir Nigel, was so cultured that he said, "Nobody in the whole world knows it, save you and I," and referred to Flotsam and Jetsam as he was swimming out into the path of the rising sun. Jetsam is such an ugly word. It is only fitting that on his tombstone Lady Tintagel should have had inscribed an impressive and high-sounding misquotation from the Bible. Chapter 61. Measure Your Mind. Measure Your Mind by M.R. Traub and Frank Parker Stockbridge is apt to be a very discouraging book if you have any doubt at all about your own mental capacity. From a hasty glance through the various tests, I figure it out that I would be classified in Group B, indicating low average ability, reserved usually for those just learning to speak the English language and preparing for a career of holding a spike while another man hits it. If they ever adopt the Mentimeter tests on this journal, I shall last just about 45 minutes. And the trouble is that each test starts off so easily. You begin to think that you are so good that no one has ever appreciated you. There is, for instance, a series of 24 pictures, very badly drawn, too, Mr. Frank Parker Stockbridge. You think you are so smart picking flaws with people's intelligence. If I couldn't draw a better head than the one on page 131, I would throw up the whole business. At any rate, in each one of these pictures there is something wrong, wholly apart from the drawing. You are supposed to pick out the incongruous feature, and you have 180 seconds in which to tear the 24 pictures to pieces. The first one is easy. The rabbit has one human ear. In the second one, the woman's eye is in her hair. Pretty soft, you say to yourself. In the third, the bird has 3 legs. It looks like a cinch. Following in quick succession comes a man with his mouth in his forehead, a horse with cow's horns, a mouse with rabbit's ears, etc. You will have time for a handspring before your 180 seconds are up. But then they get tricky. There is a postcard with a stamp upside down. Well, what's wrong with that? Certainly there is no affront to nature in a stamp upside down. Neither is there in a man's looking through the large end of a telescope if he wants to. You can't arbitrarily say at the top of the page, "Mark the thing that is wrong," and then have a picture of a house with one window larger than all the others and expect anyone to agree with you that it is necessarily wrong. It may look queer, but so does the whole picture. You can't tell. The big window may open from a room that needs a big window. I am not going to stultify myself by making things wrong about which I know none of the facts. Who am I that I should condemn a man for looking through the large end of a telescope? Personally, I like to look through the large end of a telescope. It only shows the state of personal liberty in this country when a picture of a man looking at a ship through the large end of a telescope is held before the young and branded as wrong. Arguing these points with yourself takes up quite a bit of time, and you get so out of patience with the man that made up the examination that you lose all heart in it. Then come some pictures about which I am frankly in the dark. There is a Ford car with a rather funny-looking mudguard, but who can pick out any one feature of a Ford and say that it is wrong? It may look wrong, but I'll bet that the car in this picture, as it stands, could pass many a big car on a hill. Then there is a boy holding a bat, and while his position isn't all that a coach could ask, the only radically wrong thing that I can detect about the picture is that he is evidently playing baseball in a clean white shirt with a necktie and a rather natty cap set perfectly straight on his head. It is true he has his right thumb laid along the edge of the bat, but maybe he likes to bunt that way. There is something in the picture that I don't get, I'm afraid, just as there is in the picture of two men playing golf. One is about to putt. Aside from the fact that his putter seems just a trifle long, I should have to give up my guess and take my defeat like a man. But I do refuse to concede anything on picture number 22. Here a baby is shown sitting on the floor. He appears to be about 1.5 years old. Incidentally, he's a very plain baby. Strewn about him on the floor are the toys that he has been playing with. There are a ball, a rattle, a ring, a doll, a bell, and a pair of roller skates. Evidently, the candidate is supposed to be aghast at the roller skates in the possession of such a small child. The man who drew that picture had evidently never furnished playthings for a small child. I can imagine nothing that would delight a child of 1.5 years more than a pair of roller skates to chew and spin and hit himself in the face with. They could also be dropped on Daddy when Daddy was lying on the floor in an attempt to be sociable. Of all the toys arranged before the child, the roller skates are the most logical. I suppose that the author of this test would insist on calling a picture wrong which showed a baby with a safety razor in his hand or an overshoe on his head, and yet a photograph of the public library could not be more true to life. That is my great trouble in taking tests and examinations of any kind. I always want to argue with the examiner, because the examiner is always so obviously wrong. Chapter 62: The Brow Elevation in Humor. After an author has been dead for some time, it becomes increasingly difficult for his publishers to get out a new book by him each year. Without recourse to the Ouija board, Harper & Brothers managed to do very well by Mark Twain, considering that all they have to work with are the books that he wrote when he was alive. Each year we get something from the pen of the famous humorist, even though the ink has faded slightly. An introduction by Albert Bigelow Paine and a hitherto unpublished photograph as a frontispiece, and there you are, the season's new Mark Twain book. This season it is Moments with Mark Twain, a collection of excerpts from his works for quick and handy reading. We may look for further books in this series in 1923, 1924, 1925, etc., to be entitled Half Hours with Mark Twain, the selection's a trifle longer, Pleasant Weekends with Mark Twain, Indian Summer with Mark Twain, etc. There is an interesting comparison between this sample bottle of the humor of Mark Twain and that contained in the volume entitled Something Else Again by Franklin P. Adams. The latter is a volume of verse and burlesques which have appeared in the newspapers and magazines. In the days when Mark Twain was writing, it was considered good form to spoof not only the classics but surplus learning of any kind. A man was popularly known as an affected cuss when he could handle anything more erudite than a nasal past participle or two in his own language, and anyone who wanted to qualify as a humorist had to be able to mispronounce any word of over 3 syllables. Thus we find Mark Twain, in the selections given in this volume, having amusing trouble with the pronunciation of Michael Angelo and Leonardo da Vinci, expressing surprise that Michael Angelo was dead, picking flaws in the old master's execution, and complaining of the use of foreign words which have their equivalent in a nobler language, English. There certainly is no harm in this school of humor, and it has its earnest and prosperous exponents today. In fact, a large majority of the people still like to have someone poke fun at the things in which they themselves are not proficient, whether it be pronunciation, Latin, or bricklaying. But there is an increasingly large selection of the reading public who, while they may not be expert in Latin composition, nevertheless do not think that a Latin word in itself is a cause for laughter. A French phrase thrown in now and then for metrical effect does not strike them as essentially an affectation, and they are willing to have references made to characters whose native language may not have been that noblest of all languages, our native tongue. That such a school of readers exists is proved by the popularity of F.P.A.'s verses and prose. If anyone had told Mark Twain that a man could run a daily newspaper column in New York and amass any degree of fame through translations of the Odes of Horace into the vernacular, the veteran humorist would probably have slapped Albert Bigelow Paine on the back and taken the next boat for Bermuda. And yet, in Something Else Again, we find some 16 translations of Horace and other foreigners, exotic phrases such as eheu fugaces and ex parte, used without making faces over them, and a popular exposition of highly technical verse forms which James Russell Lowell and Hal Longfellow would have considered terrifically highbrow. And yet thousands of American businessmen quote F.P.A. to thousands of other American businessmen every morning. Can it be said that the American people are not so lowbrow as they like to pretend? There is a great deal of affectation in this homespun frame of mind, and many a man makes believe that he doesn't know things simply because no one has ever written about them in the American magazine. If the truth were known, we are all a great deal better educated than we will admit, and the derisive laughter with which we greet signs of culture is sometimes very hollow. In F.P.A. we find a combination which makes it possible for us to admit our learning and still be held honorable men. It is a good sign that his following is increasing. Chapter 63. Business Letters. A textbook on English composition, giving examples of good and bad letter writing, is always a mine of possibilities for one given to ruminating and with nothing in particular to do. In Business Man's English, these specimen letters are unusually interesting. It seems almost as if the authors, Wallace Edgar Bartholomew and Floyd Hurlbut, had selected their examples with a view to their fictional possibilities. It also seems to the reader as if he were opening someone else's mail. For instance, the following is given as a type of very short letter, well placed. Mr. Richard T. Green, Employment Department, Travelers Insurance Company, Chicago, Illinois. Dear Mr. Green, the young man about whom you inquire has much native ability, and while in our employ proved himself a master of office routine. I regret to say, however, that he left us under circumstances that would not justify our recommending him to you. Cordially yours, C.S. Thompson. Now, I want to know what those circumstances were, and in lieu of the facts, I am afraid that I shall have to imagine some circumstances for myself. Personally, I don't believe that the young man was to blame. Bad companions, maybe, or I shouldn't be at all surprised if he was shielding someone else, perhaps a young lady stenographer with whom he was in love. The more I think of it, the more I am sure that this was the secret of the whole thing. You see, he was a good worker and had, Mr. Thompson admits, proved himself a master of office routine. Although Mr. Thompson doesn't say so, I have no doubt but that he would have been promoted very shortly. And then he fell in love with a little brown-eyed stenographer. You know how it is yourself. She had an invalid mother at home and was probably trying to save enough money to send her father to college. And whatever she did, it couldn't have been so very bad, for she was such a nice girl. Well, at any rate, it looks to me as if the young man, while he was arranging the pads of paper for the regular Monday morning conference, overheard the office manager telling about this affair. I have good reason to believe that it was a matter of carelessness in payroll, and saying that he considered the little brown-eyed girl dishonest. At this, the young man drew himself up to his full height, and looking the office manager squarely in the eye, said, "No, Mr. Hostetter, it was I who did it, and I will take the consequences. And I want it understood that no finger of suspicion shall be pointed at Agnes Fairchild, than whom no truer, sweeter girl ever lived." "I am sorry to hear this, Ralph," said Mr. Hostetter. "You know what this means." "I do, sir," said Ralph, and turned to look out over the chimney pots of the city, biting his under lip very tight. And on Saturday, Ralph left. Since then he has applied at countless places for work, but always they have written to his old employer, Mr. Thompson, for a reference, and have received a letter similar to the one given here as an example. Naturally, they have not felt like taking him on. You cannot blame them. And in a way, you cannot blame Mr. Thompson. You see, Mr. Hostetter didn't tell Mr. Thompson all the circumstances of the affair. He just said that Ralph had confessed to responsibility for the payroll mix-up. If Mr. Thompson had been there at the time, I am sure that he would have divined that Ralph was shielding Miss Fairchild, for Mr. Thompson liked Ralph. You can see that from his letter. But as it stands now, things are pretty black for the boy, and it certainly seems as if, in this great city, there ought to be someone who will give him a job without writing to Mr. Thompson about him. This department will be open as a clearinghouse for offers of work for a young man of great native ability and master of office routine, who is just at present, unfortunately, unable to give any references, but who will, I am quite sure, justify any trust that may be placed in him in the future. This concludes our reading of Love Conquers All by Robert C. Benchley. This is Ted DeLorme, recording in Fort Mill, South Carolina, inviting you to visit LibriVox.org for more public domain audiobooks. And thank you for listening.